Hello, everyone, and welcome to my teaching demo. We're going to start off our lesson today with a bell question, which will give you a look into what we will be talking about in our lesson today. The bell question has two parts. First, what are the three branches of the United States government? And secondly, do any of them impact your life? In a traditional lesson, I would give the students about 5 minutes to answer this in their notebooks, as our routine typically goes, and they would share their answer based on random response. So in this lesson, we're continuing our work with Standard 1. It's not our first lesson. We're continuing within this standard, which is demonstrate an understanding of the fundamental historical and philosophical principles and ideas that led to the development of the American constitutional democracy. That is a mouthful. What we are talking about is the principles and the different forms of our government, foundations of the United States government. Specifically, today's agenda. Our learning goal for today is to be able to identify the three branches of the United States government to draw conclusions on their functions. We're going to be looking at each branch of the U.S. government, looking at some learning tools in order to develop that ability to draw conclusions on what they do and how they hold each other accountable. We started off with the bell question. Now we're going to be doing an interactive lecture, which will include video analysis. How is power divided in the United States government? And then we're going to be doing a stations activity with groups. It'll be all about the three branches of government. Doing this using resources, you will complete the three branches of government graphic organizer. Then we're going to have a class discussion before we do our exit ticket, which is a letter to Tom Rice. Here's the video that I'm going to show. It's a TED Ed. It's about 3 minutes long. It sets the stage for what we're talking about in this lesson. I'm not going to play it for the demo, but the link will be included in the PowerPoint that I upload for the assignment. We're going to start off talking about the executive branch. And the executive branch is outlined in the Constitution. Earlier in this standard, talking about the foundations of the United States government, we talked about the three articles. We looked at the first three articles of the U.S. Constitution. So my question for the class is, which article of the Constitution outlines the executive branch? You said Article 2, you would be correct. Article 2 of the Constitution outlines the functions and the description of the executive branch. The President of the United States is the leader of the executive branch. President's duties include many things: enforcing laws and recommending new ones. It's important to note here, the president enforces the law, recommends new laws, but they do not create laws. The office of the president is not responsible for creating laws. We're going to talk about who is here in a second. The president also serves as the commander-in-chief for the armed forces. So any armed force you could think of, which some of you will maybe going into what I've heard after high school: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Space Force. The president also meets with leaders of other countries. We have state visits where the president either goes, to another country, or another country's leader comes here. The president is truly the face of the United States on the world stage. The executive branch also consists of the presidential line of succession, which includes the president's cabinet. This is a list of people who could possibly take over the office of president if the president is no longer able to serve. Right now, the president is Joseph R. Biden. He's been president since January of 2021. He will serve in his first term as president until at least January of 2025. He is eligible to run for a second term. It's unknown if he'll do so at this time, but he still is eligible for at least one more term, as the U.S. Constitution grants each president 2 terms in office of 4 years. The vice president, Kamala Harris, she is the first female vice president of the United States. She's the first in the presidential line of succession. So if anything were to happen to President Biden, Vice President Harris would take over as president. We'll learn more about the presidential line of succession later in this unit. Lastly, we have the legislative branch. Article 1 of the Constitution outlines the legislative branch. The legislative branch is made up of 2 chambers, which is also known as Congress. We have the House of Representatives, and we have the Senate, also known as the United States Senate in official capacities. The prime duties of the legislative branch are writing bills. They draft bills. They introduce legislation. They pass these bills if they have the votes. And they debate these bills. You could actually watch Congress in session, both the House and the Senate. And we're going to see where you could do that when we look at these learning tools here in a moment. Here are the basic requirements for office. Congress is made up of 535 members, 435 in the U.S. House, 100 in the U.S. Senate, total of 535. The members per state for the U.S. House varies based on the population. So earlier this unit, we talked about debates and compromises, which included the Connecticut Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, led to this population-based and equally based system. So you see in the House, each state has one or more representatives. It is based on their population. In the Senate, there are 2 across the board, no matter what population the state has. So California has more U.S. House representatives than Wyoming because their population is higher. However, they have the same number of U.S. senators because that is equal representation per state. The terms in the U.S. House, each House member has 2 years in their term. There's no limit on the number of terms that they could serve. They could be in there for 40 years. They could be in there for 2 years. In the Senate, there's still no limit on the number of terms. However, each term is a little bit longer than the U.S. House, and that is 6 years per term. Every 3 years, a third of the U.S. Senate is up for re-election. This year in South Carolina, one of our senators is up for re-election. That is Tim Scott, our junior senator. His general election is in November. So make sure you register to vote. The minimum age to run and be a member of the U.S. House is 25. The minimum age to be in the Senate is 30. It's important to note, I made a little bit of a speaking mistake back there. There's an age limit to be in office. However, if you are going to be that age when you get into office, you can still run. For example, our current president, Joe Biden, he ran for Senate when he was 29 years old, but he was turning 30 prior to his swearing in. So when he was entering the Senate, he was 30. You could still run at 29 if you are going to be in office prior to your 30 or after your 30th birthday. Same for the House. All right, so next we're going to talk about the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is outlined in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. This branch is made up of the court system. So a lot of people have the misconception that it's just the Supreme Court. There are other courts that appeal up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. So what their decision is, you can't appeal up. Their decision goes. And we've seen the Supreme Court in the news a lot, especially in the last week or so, due to some controversial decisions that have been stirring up some controversy around the country. Their ruling is final, and there's nowhere to appeal up to in those cases. Courts decide arguments about the meaning of laws, how laws are applied, and whether or not laws break the rules of the Constitution, aka unconstitutional. What's important to know, I listed 3 duties of the court system, especially the Supreme Court. It's important for you to know they do not create laws. Even though it may seem like they create laws, the only branch that has the power to create laws, pass bills into law, is the legislative branch. So the judicial branch cannot make laws. They decide what the laws mean, what the founders meant when they were drafting these laws, drafting the Constitution. They argue, they decide arguments on how the laws are applied, if they're being applied equally, if they're being applied, in discriminatory ways. And lastly, whether or not they're unconstitutional. And those are the 9 current members of our Supreme Court there in the bottom left. They are 9 members which have been nominated by presidents going back to George H.W. Bush in the 90s. and Ronald Reagan in the 80s. So their terms are lifetime terms. When they are served or when they are nominated and confirmed and put in the Supreme Court, they could serve until they retire or die. And they don't have to go for re-election. So here's a little analogy for y'all, for you visual people. How are the three branches of government like the human body? And think of how I described each of these branches as I described this. The head of the human body, which you see on the top of this picture, has a face on it. The head is the executive branch, the face of the country, the brains behind the politics in the country, the leader of their political party, our chief diplomat, etc., besides the Secretary of State. And then the arms. The legislative branch has two chambers, the House and the Senate. The arms are picking at laws, they're creating laws, they're making stuff with those hands. That's the legislative branch. And then the Supreme Court's constitutional duty is to keep the country and our laws stable, to keep the country and our laws steady, just like your torso and your legs are. This is just a fun little analogy that I like to introduce when teaching this lesson, just so that you can have like a visual picture of something that's not so foreign. All right, now we're going to divide up into three groups. Classroom is going to be divided equally. There are websites on our Google Classroom page that I'm going to show y'all here on the demo in a minute. Using these resources, these learning tools, as well as some resources that I created, you're going to be completing a graphic organizer. You're going to have about 10 minutes, maybe 15, depending on how time works out at each station. And we are going to swap the share real quick. I'm going to show you all these resources. First of all, here is the graphic organizer that y'all are going to be completing as a group. There's three sections here: the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. Here are the resources. First of all, we have the White House website. On this White House website, the executive branch, remember, gives you a lot of information about our current administration, their policies, a bunch of different things for you to answer the questions that I'm going to provide for you. And then you have congress.gov. This is the legislative branch. On this website, Congress is not currently in session, but you're actually able to watch Congress in session, as I mentioned. There's different bills. You could search up bills, so say HR 1 as an example. All sources, it'll bring you to that bill. There's also historical information. There's information over here about the legislative process. There's the current members of Congress. Whole bunch of good stuff for you to complete this assignment with. Then you have the Supreme Court. Whole bunch of stuff on the top about the court, the justices, what you want to do if you want to visit the court, so frequently asked questions, information, the schedule, a lot of stuff on this learning tool. And then I created 3 different handouts that I'm going to be passing out to everyone. I would pass out to everyone in a class. Has some fun facts, kind of expanding a little bit on what we talked about in our interactive lecture. Pay attention to the bottom of these pages, because this graphic organizer you're going to complete based on these requirements. So as an example, here's the executive branch handout. On your graphic organizer as a group, list 3 interesting facts from the website. 3 things that if I go on this website and I look at these things, I will know about the executive branch. After you write them down, discuss and expand on them, which is discuss them and kind of draw conclusions on what they mean. Do that with your group. List the names of the president's cabinet members. And be sure that you include their title and agency, because the president's cabinet is the presidential line of succession, which we're going to talk about later this unit and later in this class. So it's important for you to create this foundation of knowledge there. And then just a fun question for this section: who was the president when you were born? A lot of y'all were born in 2003, 2004. So look that up. There's a historical portion of that website and complete that question. Then we have the same sort of deal with the legislative branch, different questions. I'm going to list interesting facts, Who is our House representative, which we've talked about. So just look that up. And then this is the big one down here. Which presidents have been impeached and what were their charges? Were they found guilty or acquitted? I'm not going to tell y'all the answer for this, but what I will say is what I want y'all to be, I want to be sure. What were their charges? So as a hint, if there was a president that was impeached twice, which there was, make sure you write down all of their charges. There are 2 separate impeachment trials, so make sure you write that down too. Then lastly, the same thing with the judicial branch. List the 9 Supreme Court justices. There's a link on that page that shows you just that. And then big thing, list the current justices by seniority. If you write down the list of justices, you could even put a number 1 to 9. Put a 1 near the one that has the most seniority, so the person that's serving longest, and a 9 next to the person who has served the shortest amount of time in years. Then after we complete this, I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. We're going to discuss the work that we just did so that we could hear it. A lot of y'all are auditory learners, which this may help y'all. We're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of each branch of government. How do the branches of government prevent each other from becoming too powerful? And this is a concept which we're going to talk about extensively throughout the course, especially during Unit and Standard 1. That answer is checks and balances. So I gave you the answer to the second question in the discussion, but just to give y'all this idea, an idea for this question. If the nation was founded in 2022, do you believe there would be a system of checks and balances? Think about how polarizing our politics are today. Do you believe that if we said we are kicking the US government out and we are starting from scratch, do you believe that we would have a system of checks and balances? Or do you think that one branch may be ever so powerful? That's your opinion. There's no wrong answers for this question. Just make sure you're able to explain. And then our final activity for today, an exit ticket, which is a letter to Tom Rice, who is our congressional representative. Tom Rice works under the legislative branch. In current event news, he has just been what is called primaried, which means that a Republican ran against him in the primary, which we'll learn about in Standard 3. What that is, it's essentially an election before an election, but we'll talk about that later in this course. He serves in the legislative branch for now, will not after next January. As part of your exit ticket, since he is still our House representative, he's still going to be the person you're going to contact. You're going to be thinking of a school appropriate social or economic issue that you're passionate about. Remember, school appropriate, we've talked about our course expectations. You know the guidelines for school appropriateness. In the House, Tom Rice has the ability to draft and introduce legislation to the remainder of the members of Congress in the House. You are going to be writing a letter to Tom Rice, notifying him of your position on an issue, explaining how your proposed idea could be eventually become law. How could it come from a bill to law? Which branches of government must it go through? Then, in order for y'all to generate a question, ask Tom Rice one question about Congress from a House member's perspective. What's something that you're curious about in Congress? I know it could be a foreign idea to you, but based on what I've explained today in this lesson, what are some things that you're curious about his everyday life, about his schedule, etc.? So this is a great way for y'all to participate in some informed action. And that will conclude it for our lesson demo on 3 branches of government. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section below. Thank you.